Okay, here we go. We are going through the Bible in a year, trying to put it together by looking at big chunks of it, looking at the books, looking at a little bit of the chronology. But the problem is right now is that if we're doing it chronologically, then we're in trouble. We're in First Chronicles, and we are out of sequence with chronology now. So far, it's been pretty much chronological. Well, not so much. We started in the book of Genesis with the creation of the heaven and the earth, but we did bring out at that point that there were things that happened before the creation of the heavens and the earth. It says that the angels were singing, that there was love between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, that there was a plan of salvation. So there was a lot of things going on before the beginning of what we know as the creation of the heavens and the earth. But for the most part, from that point on, from Genesis 1:1, it's pretty much chronological. Every now and then there's a little parenthesis. You get to Genesis chapters 10 and 11, it's sort of a parenthesis there. It really belongs after 12, but it's a setup for the things that are going to happen in chapter 12. For the most part, it's chronological. Well, now it steps out of that, and that's what's going to make it a little bit difficult for us as we go through the Bible, at least in the way that it's constructed and given to us in the English versions that we have. We're in Chronicles, which goes all the way back to the book of 1 Samuel. So you get Genesis, and then you get Exodus when they came out by the blood of the Lamb. You get Leviticus, all about sacrifices. You get Numbers, their journey from Egypt to the Promised Land, supposed to be 11 days. Took them 40 years. You get into Deuteronomy when he gives them the law the second time. You get into Joshua when Joshua divides up the land and gives it to them. You get into the book of Judges. In the book of Judges, the 400 years of just cycles of trouble and deliverance. In the midst of that, in the book of the Judges, you have Ruth. And then we get to the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, which become the introduction of earthly kings, the rejection of God as king, the rejection of the theocracy as such, and now they're going to have earthly kings. And we find that God being the first king and Saul being the second king, not so good. And then King David, pretty good. And then we get to Solomon, and Solomon, of course, in the books, right, 1st, 2nd Samuel, he brings prosperity. David brings peace. When Solomon dies, there's a division, and it really happens over taxes, and it splits up. The northern kingdom goes to the north. 10 kings go to the north. all bad kings for the most part. In the south, there's the two tribes. Kings are okay. Some of them much better than others. But most of them okay. So to close this out with everybody sort of degrading and going down in the middle of 2nd Samuel, you have the northern kingdom. They're conquered, so they're going to go into exile. And then you find 15 years later that the southern kingdom, Judah, also falls and goes into exile. And then we get to the book of 1 Chronicles, which brings us all the way back to 1 Samuel. But it does more than that, because Chronicles just means a recording of history. So an awful lot of Chronicles is just a recording of history, and you have, especially in the opening chapters, you have chapter after chapter after chapter of genealogy with a few little tiny stories mixed in there. But it's just genealogies, the first 9 chapters. But these are really important. A lot of people now are paying for genealogies big time, with DNA and 23andMe and Ancestry.com and all of these kinds of things. Well, the genealogies are really important, and they're also really important to show us that Jesus came through the family tree according to the way that God said that would happen. And so it gives the genealogy of the kings, it gives the genealogy of priests, it gives the genealogies of many, many people. But they're records, they're family records of what's going on. So that's pretty amazing. And then it picks up in chapter 10. It's going to talk mostly about David. First Chronicles is going to mostly talk about David. And so didn't, when we were in the books of Samuel, talk about David. But Chronicles is just really going to talk about like the good David, not so much like the bad David, but the good David. And it starts in chapter 10, if you have a paper Bible or even a digital Bible and you're trying to follow along, and you can see, the first 9 chapters is all these genealogies, all these histories. And chapter 10 talks about Saul and how Saul kills himself. And Saul killing himself, falling on his sword. And then there was the account of the guy who went and told David, Saul was suffering and Saul said, kill me. So I, killed him for his, sake, to take him out of his misery. And David was like, what did you do to the Lord's anointed? You thought this was a good thing. And David takes his life. David gets rid of the guy. So chapter 10 of First Chronicles, Saul takes his life. Chapter 11, David becomes the king. He becomes king over Israel. And then it gives all of his conquests. And particularly, it starts with him in the conquest of Jerusalem. David takes the city of Jerusalem. It's called the city of David. It becomes known as, the city of peace. It becomes the place where the temple is going to be built. And Chronicles goes through that. It chronicles until it gets to the temple. And it talks about, we get into more names and more people. We get into David's mighty men in chapter 11. And it gives the names of these guys. Well, why does it give their names? Well, because they're important people. And when we go through some other things, if we really want to dig deep, we get into the names of these people. And plus, you'd like it for your name to be there if you were one of David's mighty men. And so then it talks about those that joined David in chapter 12. And, David's just building quite the team. People are loyal to him, and he's a conqueror. And then, David loves the Lord. And so he conquers Jerusalem, and then he brings the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. And it's there that it's going to stay, and ultimately the temple will be built around that. And then it talks about David and his family, David defeating the Philistines, David bringing peace, again bringing the Ark to Jerusalem. He loved the Lord. He wanted the Lord to be present in Jerusalem and people to be aware of the presence of God. And it talks about him ministering, and it gives the day that David appoints Asaph and his associates to give praise to the Lord. And then there's a big song in there in the middle, this big long song, ascribe to the Lord, and glory do his name, ascribe to the Lord, all ye families of the nations, let the heavens rejoice, let the earth be glad, let the nations say, the Lord reigns. David understood that God reigned and that God ruled over him as well. And then you find that God gives promises to David, particularly the promise. This is very important because this is a Messiah promise. And the Messiah will come through David's family tree. That God promises that David will never cease to have somebody on the throne. Well, the throne of Jerusalem is uninhabited, but the throne of heaven and earth, Jesus coming through David, lives on forever and ever. You find David building the altar. You find the preparations for the temple. He wanted to build the temple, verse 22 and 23. He wanted to build it, but he couldn't build it. But he put everything in place to make it happen. Put everything in place. And Solomon was able to take the blueprints and take the ideas. And he has the divisions of the priests there and where the priests will be, the musicians. David loved music and had all kinds of musicians. Listen to this in chapter 25. David, together with the commanders of the army, set apart some of the sons of Asaph and Heman for the ministry of prophesying, accompanied by harps and lyres and cymbals. And here's a list of the men for that service. And it tells all of the men that were there. They were skilled. They were good musicians. He had the gatekeepers. He had everything set up. And Solomon's the one who's going to do it. David's plans for the temple are found there in chapter 28. And then, of course, David brings all these gifts for building the temple. And you end with Solomon being acknowledged as king and David dying. So that's really the essence of First Chronicles. We just did the whole thing in 10 minutes and 3 seconds. So that's the book of First Chronicles. We'll get into the book of Second Chronicles and see what's happening there. So may the Lord bless you guys. Hopefully this is helping us to put it all together. And once we put it all together, we're going to come back and we're going to go through it again and see some of the streams that run through all of the scriptures. It's only one story from beginning to end. Hey, bless you guys.